Now then, Apple is a trading name which is synonymous with technology, emerging from the late 70s and booming into the noughties like there was no tomorrow, and showing the public that MP3 players, which had been out for several years prior, needed a shinier case before they were viable products. But it's not the only technology company that employed a fruit-based moniker for its business purposes. Tangerine Computer Systems emerged only a few years after Apple, in an attempt to ride the computer boom of the late 70s and early 80s, along with other fruit and nut based companies such as Acorn, Apricot and Orange Micro. But while we're more than familiar with the crunchy green fruit, this little orange one seems to have been lost sometime before the 80s were out. So, let's explore why, whilst looking at their budget and most famous computer system, the Oric 1. Tangerine weren't new to the low-cost computer game. Their earlier machine, the Micro Tan 65, released in 1979, was a 0.75 MHz machine which retailed at just £79.35 in kit form or £90.85 assembled. Unlike Sinclair's early ZX80 models, the Micro Tan was aimed more at laboratory use and wasn't widely available in retail shops. But Paul Johnson, who was Tangerine's sole hardware designer, maintains that the Sinclair models, along with others such as Acorn's Atom, contain TV-out circuitry which was pioneered on the Micro Tan. Having seen Sinclair's success with its early machines, however, Tangerine neglected their currently in development Tiger machine, which was designed to compete in the business computer market, and instead set up a sub-company under the instruction from their main investor, British car auctions owner David Wickens. Now, this new company was called Oric Products International Limited, and it emerged in 1982 purely to push Tangerine's home computer line. The Oric 1 would become the sub-company's first machine, with Oric being a partial anagram of the word micro. Now, Tangerine's role was then to develop the machine and license it to the new company, which it charged £100,000 for upfront and then 50p per unit for the first 100,000 sold. The technology was largely based around the original Micro Tan architecture, with an incorporated ULA utilised. Now, this shrank the amount of individual chips required, similar to how the BBC Micro was shrunk into the Acorn Electron later in this era. Oric had hoped to launch in late 1982, with many buyers opting to purchase after suffering delays with the shipment of their ordered Sinclair Spectrum models. It's a sad irony then that the Oric was also late to market, failing on its 28-day shipping promise in much the same way that Sinclair did. Now, after a few delays and a scrapping of an additional proposed 32K model, the machine debuted in early 1983 and initially sold a reasonable 22,000 units in the United Kingdom, plus an additional 35,000 systems in France, where it was the top-selling machine, which goes to show how ahead of the curve the UK was at this time. This was thanks in part to the Oric's RGB output, allowing good connectivity on the French CCAM format TVs. Now, total sales eventually landed at over 160,000. Sadly though, even with this combined figure, it was less than the 350,000 that Oric had hoped to sell, and Sinclair's Spectrum was starting to sell considerably more, boosted by its brand name, earlier launch date and better marketing strategy, with Oric sending out unfinished, sometimes broken and crucially undocumented units early to journalists. Now, this led to incorrect reports, such as the system only having 2 colours in high-res mode when it was in fact 8. Thankfully, these sales figures would prove good enough for Oric to later be bought out by Eden Spring Investments plc and injected with enough cash to produce Oric 1's follow-up model, the Atmos. Okay, let's talk about the keyboard. I feel I should stress how drastically bad this tic-tac inspired design actually is. If you've ever tried typing on a Spectrum, you'll know it's a painful and squidgy experience. Now, Oric upped the stakes on that front and produced a keyboard that's not only painful, but 20 times harder to hit the actual key that you want. At least they had the good grace to give it a proper spacebar, I suppose. And case-wise, the system is about the same size as the Spectrum, featuring 2 Go Faster stripes and a contrasting approach to colour. Aesthetically, I love it. It's got something of a timeless quality, a bit like 2001 A Space Odyssey. Housed internally is a MOS 6502A CPU running at 1 MHz. The Oric shipped in either 16KB or 48KB variants to compete with Sinclair's offerings. The 16KB model was initially priced at £99.95 to undercut the 16KB Spectrum by £30. But manufacturing problems and an inability to turn profit meant a revised price of £129 for the 16KB and £169 for the 48K model by May 1983. As cruel fate would have it, this was the same time that Sinclair would discount their 16KB models to under £100. The machines actually had an extra 16KB of RAM, bringing the 48K up to a potential 64K, but unmodified, the 16KB of ROM housing the operating system and Oric's basic interpreter, Oric Extended Basic 1, shifted into this high memory space on boot up. The first machines actually had a major glaring basic error where the if-then-else clauses failed to work unless the first statement after the else was a print function. And as Oric Basic was actually a sub-licensed version of Microsoft Basic, these problems were escalated back to Bill Gates himself, who reportedly got on the case. Unfortunately, these fixes took a little too long to make them worthwhile. The ROM also contained a bugged error checking routine for recording programs, which meant that sometimes saved programs would fail to load back in, which was annoying to say the least, especially if you'd just written 1,000 lines of BASIC. Spectrum owners were, however, probably jealous to see that a real sound chip was also stowed under the hood, the GI8912. And graphically, two modes were available: low-res text mode at 28 rows by 40 characters and high-res mode offering 200 by 240 pixels, with 3 lines of text thrown in at the bottom for good measure. Now, due to Oric's cost-cutting design, like the Spectrum, it suffered from colour clash, although whereas the Spectrum applied colour in 8-pixel blocks, the Oric could have different colours on different pixel rows. Now, this clash of colours, along with the rest of the screen, could be emitted on your standard RF, or additionally a luxurious RGB port was provided. The machine also features an expansion bus and your standard tape connectivity. Almost 300 games would be released for the Oric One over its lifespan, most featuring the typical gaudy colours we'd expect from this era, sitting somewhere between the Spectrum and the Dragon 32 in terms of on-screen aesthetics. Using the keyboard is a pretty shambolic affair unless you love pressing calculator buttons, and given that the system had no joystick ports, you had to fall back onto an interface to get the most out of your Oric gameplay. Here are some of my favourite gaming delights. The Oric One occasionally charted above the ZX81 and VIC-20 in terms of UK computer sales, but would never touch the success of the Sinclair model it so reached for. On the 13th of October 1983, Oric's production factory burnt to the ground. The facility was re-established immediately elsewhere, but this still caused further delays. Only days later, a neighbouring factory also burst into flames, provoking suspicion that the attacks were arson, with the first attempt being on the wrong factory, and Oric being a sad victim of collateral damage. Later, after Eden Spring bailed Oric out in 1984, partly in response to Acorn's September 1983 stock market success, a budget IBM PC-compatible micro, which Oric had been developing, was shelved, but this provided enough finance for Oric to continue with the Atmos machine, the Oric One's successor. Oric's new machine, however, was again overshadowed by a new Sinclair product, the QL. Now, both the Atmos and the QL failed to gain the market share of their earlier machines, with the Atmos being only a slight upgrade of the Oric 1, and the QL lacking the backwards compatibility customers demanded. Strangely then, it would seem that a successful machine would have needed to be somewhere in between the two. Another high-spec machine would also follow for Oric, the Stratos, but after its release the company almost immediately folded on the 2nd of February 1985. The rest, we say, is history. Thank you for watching my review of the Oric 1. I've got plenty more system reviews in my back catalogue and plenty more to come. So please feel free to subscribe, watch one of these videos, or even contribute to my Patreon channel. It's all very welcome. Thank you for watching. Good night.